Hey everyone, and welcome to Meetup. It is our very final meetup of the year, but as you can see on screen, we have a cracking presenter lined up for today. Today is a session that I am very, very excited about. But first, I want to give a big shout out to our sponsor, UTS. They have been amazing support over the years, and Jason is largely a reason behind that as well. So UTS has a newly developed postgraduate program in behavioral economics. UTS offers a free online introduction to behavioral economics, has online micro-credentials, and a grad cert and masters in behavioral economics designed to train the next generation of behavioral economists. To learn more, I'll post a link in the chat. So today we have Jason Collins doing a year in review for the big behavioral science takeouts for 2024. Jason really is one of the OGs of behavioral science in Australia. He co-founded and led PwC's behavioral economic team. I think it was back around 2012, 2014. I think that was probably one of the first ever teams in Australia. In 2015, that team won the PwC Global Innovation Challenge, beating something like 80 teams across 20 different countries around PwC. He also built and led the data science and consumer insights team at ASIC, and he's now a senior lecturer at UTS and the program director for both the grad cert and masters of behavioral economics. On top of that, Jason also set up the Australian Behavioural Science Meetup many years ago with Will, and that's what brings us all here today. So without further ado, Jason, over to you. And sorry, one other thing. Could everyone throw their questions in the chat, and we'll get to it at the very, very end.
Okay, thanks, Aaron. So just take a moment to share my slides. Okay, hopefully you're seeing something along the lines of what I'm seeing. So brilliant. So although I guess it's a bit of a year in review, sort of I guess framing that I was asked to talk about today. There's actually a lot of history around what I want to talk about. So I'm gonna actually wind the clock back a little bit, give a bit of history around and background around what I'm going to talk about, because I know that although myself I feel like I've been immersed in this for a long time, some of this background is going to be new for a lot of you. So for me, the first inklings of what you might call doubt emerged around January 2012. And at that time, I was one of those people who, I was on the behavioral economics bandwagon. I'd read, Dan Ariely. I was sort of, anyone who would listen, I'd tell them all about the Dan Ariely experiments. Read Daniel Kahneman's Thinking Fast and Slow. And January 2012, I actually wrote a review of the book and called it one of the best books I've ever read. Still holding quite high regard, but that was sort of where my mindset was at the time. But then around, well, in fact, it wasn't around, it was actually in January 2012. It was actually this article that sort of got on your screen was posted the day after I did the Daniel Kahneman post. And there was this article by science journalist Ed Yong. And this article was about a famous paper by the psychologist John Buff and friends. And that original paper this article was about basically was quite a famous experiment, that paper, where they had participants solve problems involving scrambled words. And the unique element of that experiment was that the experimental participants, they're actually timed as to how fast they walked down the hallway outside the experimental room when they left. And the crux of this experiment was some of those participants, the word scrambles that they'd been solving had words related to the elderly, so old, grey, Florida. And those people, at least in the original experiment, they walked more slowly when they left. So in some ways, they'd been primed to act more elderly. And this effect became known as the Florida effect. Now, this article by Ed Yong basically described a replication of that original experiment. So a new set of experimenters basically went and ran the experiment again. And the punchline is they didn't find the Florida effect, or actually, to be more precise, they only found an effect when whoever was doing the timing knew about the experiment and knew who was who. So when they had effectively an independent timer, so someone who, actually a laser, or I should say infrared sensor, there was no effect. And this is sort of, at least for me, this was my introduction to what became known as the replication crisis. And part of why it became, I guess, so interesting was actually the reaction to this article, at least in the short term. So John Barth, he wrote an article, a blog post on Psychology Today titled "Nothing in Their Heads." So a fairly ungracious way to deal with the failed replication. But it was really the beginning of a flood. And that flood sort of became, really obvious to everyone in 2015 when the many labs published this quite famous paper estimating the reproducibility of psychological science. So I guess the actual collaboration named the Open Science Collaboration. And basically what they did is they took 100 psychology experiments from top psychology journals, and they basically ran those experiments again. And depending on which measure you use to sort of say, was this a success, between sort of 36 to 39% of those replications actually showed there was an effect when the experiment was run again. And this is a diagram out of that paper. The left chart shows the plot of p-values. So a p-value, that's a measure of how likely you are to see data as extreme as you do see if there was actually no underlying effect. And the original studies all have very low p-values below the magical threshold we use in psychology of 0.05. That makes them statistically significant. That's the word we use. And of course, you look at what happened in the replication studies, and those p-values basically were anywhere between close to 0 all the way up to almost 1. They were quite a wide range, reflecting again that only depending on your exact measure, but around 39% of the studies actually were statistically significant in the replications. There was also a pretty big difference in the effect sizes. So the original studies had quite large effect sizes. The effect sizes in the replications were much smaller, and in a significant proportion of the replications, the effect size were actually in the opposite direction to the original. Now, this was, of course, I guess, a really big moment for psychology. But this replication crisis isn't unique to psychology. It's something that's affected economics, medicine, nutrition, science, a lot of other fields. But that said, given this paper, given the low rate of replication, psychology and the behavioral sciences are the real poster child of the replication crisis. So why this particular bit of history? Well, in some ways, it's simply the case that it ain't over yet. These failed replications are continuing. The scandals are continuing to pile up. And what I really want to talk a bit about is the events of sort of way back then. They're not unique to a moment in the past. It's part of actually an ongoing pattern. And just to give an example of a recent failed replication, this is my favorite one for 2024. So last year, there was a paper in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences that said that thinking about God increases acceptance of artificial intelligence in decision-making. And what they had the participants in the experiment do, they would write about one of two things. Some of them would write about God, the treatment group. Some of them would write about their day, what they did, the control group, before they answered a range of questions around their preferences between human and artificial intelligence recommendations. And so when they were thinking about God, the experimenters found they were more willing to use artificial intelligence. It's worth briefly just noting here, like this is really quite typical of the sort of paper that you see in these where there's failed replications, people testing funky ideas, weak on theory, but a nice headline, and makes it suitable for tabloid sort of journals like PNAS. So this year, however, so Don Moore and friends, they ran a high-powered series of replications of that experiment on whether, I guess having God in mind makes you more likely to accept an AI recommendation. And on this chart, you can see the red dots are the original experiments. The green triangles represent the effect sizes in the new experiments. pretty close to zero. Those bars around them are confidence intervals, which all cover zero. Basically, they did basically nothing replicated. And when they did this replication, they noted that given what they found, the original experiments had only about what they call 9% statistical power. So there was only a 9% probability in each experiment that they'd find anything on average. So even if the effects did exist, the original studies were unlikely to find it. Now, these studies were pre-registered. I'm going to talk a bit about pre-registration in a bit. And pre-registration is where you declare you're going to do the experiment beforehand and say how you're going to do it. But given there was pre-registration, there was only a 1 in 10,000 chance that, or less than 1 in 10,000 chance that they would have found effects in this experiment, given how weak the effects likely truly are. So God truly was on the original experimenter's side when they ran that experiment. So even today, we have this flow of failed replications. Maybe it's a quick note to put here. There's actually a paper that's sort of been doing the rounds the last couple of weeks, which I haven't thrown in a slide on, where sometimes when there's a failed replication, you then run it again, and sometimes you do actually sort of rehabilitate the original result. You know, sometimes you just don't find effects by chance, even when there actually is a true effect. So saying something didn't replicate doesn't mean that there's absolutely nothing there. I think in this case, though, in this sort of God, you know, thinking about God and AI and the strength of the evidence from these particular replications, probably not a lot. So that's you know, that ongoing little story. Now, to move into my next bit, I want to talk about sort of comes to a crescendo this year, but I have to go back into the past again a bit. And actually, this one's also about at least starts with another failed replication. So I don't know how many of you heard about this article, super famous article. In some ways, at least one of the punchlines is on this article in the red text. I couldn't find in the time I looked one without this red mark. But basically, back in 2012, again in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences, they feature a lot in these stories of failed replications. They published a paper where effectively a group of experimenters, Lisa Hsu and friends, had basically examined whether getting people to sign at the top of a form would make them more likely to be honest when they filled out the form. And if you think about the logic of this, if you sign at the top of a form, you're more likely to, so maybe in some ways you're there going, okay, I've declared I'm going to tell the truth, I'm going to tell the truth. Whereas perhaps if you hadn't, signed it yet, you were signing at the end, by then you've already filled it out. You're not being told you should be honest. And so as a result, you'll be less honest. That was the basic idea behind it. And what they found, and I'll show you some of the results in a second, I'll walk through it, is effectively signing at the top, as the headline suggests, makes people more likely to be honest. The last thing to look at before I go off this slide is just to note the authors, because there's a couple of the co-authors here are going to star through what I'm going to talk about. Francesca Gino, from Harvard Business School, and Dan Ariely, sort of author of Particularly Irrational, sort of, I guess, star of many of the stories I was telling back before January 2012. Were both co-authors on this experiment. This here on the screen, this is just a couple of the research artifacts that they used when they ran the experiment. You can see on the right, you sign down the bottom after declaring, in this case, declaring sort of your effort around attending the experiment for your payment. On the right, you declare, you sign at the top and then declare what's going on. So the order of the basically signature before sort of declaring what's happening leads to, you know, hopefully leads to more honesty. And that's actually what they showed in that paper. So this is one of the figures from the paper. They had to report how many puzzles they'd solved. They got paid based on how many puzzles they solved, but it was just self-reported. And when people signed at the top, they actually reported the true number of puzzles they solved, whereas those who didn't sign or signed at the bottom actually reported more puzzles than they really solved. So a little bit of fudging around the edges for those who had signed at the bottom. Great little experimental result. There's a couple of lab experiments in the paper on this very point. And then what was most interesting is there was actually a field experiment reported in this paper too. And the field experiment involved the declaration by drivers when they were getting car insurance. So when they were getting car insurance, they had to say how many miles they drive. And the more miles they drive, the higher the premium will be. And what they did is they got people to either sign at the top or sign at the bottom of this of their reporting mileage form that sets their insurance policy. And those who signed at the top declared that they drive further, and as a result got a higher premium. And I suppose the idea being there that if they're going to declare say they're driven further when they sign at the top, they're probably being more honest, not fudging around the edges to avoid a bit of premium. And so once again, you've got a real life example of what's happened of this concept. So that's the start of this story. But this story really just becomes like, it's really quite amazing sort of what came out of this little beginning. And the first little piece that came out of it comes in this first paper, which is just a simple replication of the experiments. So Ariella Crystal, Ashley Willens actually started this little bit of work where they ran some replications in the lab of the lab experiments themselves. And what they found is they found that they were having trouble getting the same results as the original paper. So they actually roped in the original co-authors of that 2012 paper and said, can you come work with us? Let's try and see what happens. And what they found is when they ran it again, there was basically no effect. So this is like out of that second paper. They ran 6 studies. I think, I can't remember if it was 1 or 2 of them were direct replications of exactly the same as the original paper. The others were more conceptual replications, but across all of them, they found no effect. So in some ways, you look at those lab experiments based on this and you go, actually, maybe there's nothing there. Maybe it was just a bit of a fluke as to what happened. There was also an interesting note at the end of this replication paper. So when they did these lab experiments, they also had a bit of a look at the field data. And it was just a note at the end of the paper, and they said, actually, there's something odd with the field data. The baseline readings of the odometer, so people had to say, here's the mileage my car currently has. They looked at what that mileage was for the year before and found there was actually a difference between the different groups in the experiment. And just said, actually, that might be an inkling that something's not quite right in that data. And how, in some ways it was quite prescient of them to spot that something wasn't quite right. Now, when they did this paper, they also did that, and this is a really quite handy thing, is they posted the data on on OSF, which is basically quite amazing website where nearly everyone, including myself, seems to put a lot of their experimental data and preprints nowadays. But basically, they put all the data up. So they put the data from their replication studies onto this website for others to get and have a look at. And they also put the original data from that 2012 paper up as well. So the lab data and also the field data. So amazing stuff. And that is where in some ways this next phase begins. Now, first I'll talk a bit about the field data. So if imagine you got the field data and you looked at the numbers that people were giving to say, well, how much am I going to drive in the next year when I report it? And you'd expect the odometer readings to the pattern of odometer readings look a little bit like this. This is actually real data from the UK in 2010. But as you can see, some people don't drive much, some people drive an awful lot. But there's kind of like, a quasi bell curve kind of shape there where there's a peak around certain people, amount of certain people drive. So that's what you'd expect. So what happened when the team from Data Colada, well, in fact, I should actually say an anonymous poster to the Data Colada site, what did this data look like when they got the field data and plotted it? Did it look like this chart of real data? No, it actually looked like this. So what's really interesting is of all the cars, of the 13,488 first cars owned by people, so this doesn't include cars where people own more than one, but of those 13,000 cars, not one of them drove more than 50,000 miles, but incredibly, nearly over 500 of them drove between 48 and 50,000. And what it looks like is that someone has simply gone into Excel and used a function, basically said, draw from a random distribution between 0 and 50,000 for each car, and created this data. So effectively, the field data was completely made up. Now this field data, the question then becomes, like, where did it come from? And this is something that's never quite been known. So as it turned out, this field data actually came from Dan Ariely, the reason why I pointed him out on the author list at the beginning. So Dan Ariely was the one who had the contact with the insurance company, and the insurance company, and basically was also the one whose name was on the Excel file in which this data was created. So he was actually the creator of the Excel file. A Duke investigation, so Duke University investigated this, and I believe was announcement this year that no adverse findings were made. But it's pretty clear that someone along the line has done some really interesting silly buggers. Now, the question would be, and Dan Ariely sort of, I guess, pointed to the insurance company as the source of this. Now, the insurance company, they, of course, they said, well, one, they didn't even know what the experiment was, what the result would be. So how would they make up the data in such a way that it turned out so nicely for the results? But also they said they actually released the data that they said that they had given to Ariely. So we're in a point here where we don't quite know what's happened. Someone's clearly made it up. Most arrows point to Ariely, but we don't really know. But maybe a punchline here is that don't trust Dan Ariely studies. But of course, the story doesn't end here. So then 2 years after this post, another post appeared on the Data Collider site. And this one posted by the 3 primary authors of Data Collider. And on this, over a series of 4 blog posts, they investigated the data of a series of experiments by Francisca Gino, so the Harvard business professor who was one of those authors on the Sign at the Top experiment. And in that case, of those 4 articles, the very first article focused on experiment 1 from the Sign at the Top paper. So Francisca Gino provided the data for that paper. And in short, they found evidence that the data in the Excel files had been manipulated. So someone had changed the values within the files to create an effect where one wouldn't otherwise exist. And here's a plot that they created to show what had happened. So effectively, these red dots, they're the observations that seem to have been manipulated. So the sign at the bottom, they've thrown in some numbers to inflate that, so people claiming a lot more. Oops, sorry, I've just accidentally gone forward one. And for the sign at the top, they've thrown in a bunch of observations, or at least manipulated observations, so that they drag that average down. And of course, without that manipulation, there's no effect. So as a result, someone's been playing around with the data. Now, I guess you're probably starting to see some irony here. So we've got a study ostensibly about honesty, trying to get people to sign on the top to show more honesty. And here we've got study 1, looks like the data's been manipulated, fraudulently adjusted to get an effect. And the field study 3, the data's been made up, completely out of the blue to try and make a point. So a real mess. But we've got 2 sets of independent fraud in the same paper. Now, this particular series of blog posts from Data Collider, there was 4 of them. So there's more than one study here that was problematic. And what they found, what they actually said at the time was they'd actually been in liaison with Harvard Business School for a couple of years in advance of putting these posts up. Harvard had been investigating those claims, and as a result, Harvard put Gino on administrative leave in sort of, I guess, in preparation for the disciplinary action for that fraud. Now, how did Francisca Gino respond to this? Well, we've got a lawsuit. So Gino sued Harvard and the 3 Data Collider bloggers. I believe that she was seeking $25 million in damages. And it was it's quite an interesting response. I think this is truly a case of the Streisand effect, where it's kind of a nice story, an interesting story for science before this lawsuit, And this took it to the next level where suddenly it was, in the form of major articles across most of the major news in the US. Now, why? I guess the reason why I started telling this story now, though, is this could come. Now we get to 2024. I've taken a little bit to get here for this particular story, but finally, just a couple of months ago, the lawsuit was dismissed against the data collider bloggers. Basically, they sought a motion to dismiss, which they got. Harvard also sought a motion to dismiss this claim, which they got in part, but not in full. Part of Harvard's problem is they tweaked some of the rules around disciplinary action during the course of this investigation, and so there's probably a bit of a natural justice issue still here. But great things for the data collider bloggers. I imagine it was quite stressful. Francesca Gino, of course, she claimed that as a victory, allowing to move forward. But I think what you can actually do, and I think it's one of the things, if you've got a bit of spare time after this presentation, because of this court case, you can now actually access the 1,200 plus pages of the Harvard investigation into Francesca Gino's work. And so the data collider bloggers, they had access only to some public data sets that happened to be floating around about those particular studies. So in course, the study one of that sign at the top paper, they got hold of it because the replicators of that later paper put it online. They managed to find a few others. Harvard, of course, had access to Gino's Qualtrics file, hard drives, that sort of thing. And so there's actually a really amazing story of fraud and data manipulation that emerges through that Harvard report. So it's something really worth looking at. Now, to me, the most interesting thing that came out of this story, though, and it's always kind of like I guess an unraveling drama. But for me, probably the most interesting actually came late last year. I think it was probably around September last year, I think, when a group of Gino's co-authors started up what they call the Many Co-Authors Project. So Francesca Gino had 143 co-authors over the course of, I guess, her scientific career up to that point in time. And all those co-authors, the work with Gino was naturally tainted by the fact that they'd published with her. So this group set up the Many Co-Authors Project, where what they would do is for all those articles in which they were co-authors, they would seek to understand who obtained the experimental data, and to work out, well, if it was Gino, for which cases was Francesca Gino provided that data, who has the data, and to actually try and investigate, well, what do we think about the data? And here's the latest version of one of the charts on the Many Co-Authors website. So you can actually just go to this Many Co-Authors website, and you can trawl through the studies and what's happening. But what you can see here was that particularly early in her career, from 2007 to 2013, Gino was particularly involved in the data collection for these studies. More recently, she was probably more just, I guess, the high impact co-author on those studies. But across them all, we've got, across this particular subset, we've got, can't remember the exact number on this chart of papers. I think it like, oh, sorry, 200, I think it was 240 odd papers are on this chart. But basically, of those, 167 had Gino involved in data collection, 41 where the actual data was shared with co-authors, and we've got 15 of the studies where the data so far has been posted either on this well, I guess generally posted on other websites, but linked to from this website. Now, what's really quite amazing about this particular exercise wasn't necessarily the fact that many of the data sets that Gino worked with look a bit sketchy or can't be found. It was actually what other people found, or what the people found about other studies as they looked through all these. And for most of these studies, even the ones where Gino was not involved in data collection, the data is simply not yet available. And in many cases, the authors aren't willing to post that data. So we're actually left in a world where even for those studies that aren't Gino's, we've got some doubt about whether or not those studies are going to, whether the data, well, might even be not made up, but also whether we can have a look at it again and see if there's anything fishy about it. And to give you a sense of this problem, let me talk about one paper that was looked at in this project. So this paper, it comes from 2015. And it's a paper around rituals. So basically, if people undertake a ritual, does it decrease performance anxiety? So Francisco Gino, the fourth author on this paper. And here's one of the charts from the paper. So here, people had this particular chart, they were about to sing. They had a little ritual to calm themselves down. And those who did the ritual, they had a lower heart rate, so 77.45 on average, than those who didn't have who didn't have a ritual, who just tried to calm down naturally or simply just went in to sing. So this was a pretty typical result in that paper. Now, that paper comprised 6 studies, a pilot and 5 others, and let's walk through each of them. And this text I'm about to show you comes straight from the many co-authors study. So the pilot study. So here they said pilots were recruited through Mechanical Turk by a research assistant overseen by Francisco Gino and Michael Norton at Harvard. The raw data and materials were not provided. The journal could not investigate this study any further. So simply, the pilot study, can't find the data, got no idea about it. How about the other studies? I'm going to go through these in slightly odd order just to reflect my story. But study 3. So study 3, recruited by Juliana Schroeder. They had an earlier version of the raw data, but when they looked at this data, they found out that 6 of the participants' data points were dropped before analysis, but their removal wasn't reported in the paper. And they said there was a reason for this. The authors report that decisions were dropped based on the RA's notes, that's research assistant's notes. But what they found is that if you put those data points back in, the effect becomes non-significant once the participants are included. So not fraud as such, but what we'd call pretty poor research practice. And without that poor research practice, there's no effect. Study 4, same story. In this case, 11 participants, their data points were removed. You put them back in, the effect's not significant anymore. So there goes study 4. How about studies 1 and 2? Well, in study 1, we've got the raw data materials simply not provided. Journal couldn't investigate this study any further. Study 1B, raw data and materials not provided. But then more than that, there are anomalies in the posted data. So this is the what you say is the I guess the process data. Specifically, there are streaks of heart rate ratings that are unlikely to have occurred naturally. The authors report they do not know who handled the data. The journal could not investigate this study any further. Study 2, similar story. Raw data and materials not provided. Journal could not investigate this study any further. And sorry, I should say, I said this came from the many co-authors website. This actually came from the journal website on a comment on the paper, but also reported on the many co-authors. So you might go, okay, simply raw data materials not provided. Here's Juliana Schroeder, who was really the co-author which really drove most of the effort behind this. And here she goes. She says, she says, I take responsibility for the research practices in studies 3 and 4, not done with malintent, called herself out, and I think that's fair enough. As it is, a lot of us, including myself, have learned a lot around what good research looks like over the last 10 years. We're not proud of what we did a decade ago. But here's the second tweet I have on the screen here. Yet I hope the issues in studies 3 and 4 do not obscure issues in other studies. Studies 1A and B have serious unexplained data anomalies. Study 2 is puzzling for several reasons, and the raw data from all 3 studies are still being hidden despite knowing where, how to find them. And I think this is really the message to take out from this many co-authors project. Like Francisca Gino said when she first heard of the project that she felt she was being singled out. And I think that's a little bit of that is true, because what it's really shown is that this broader literature has some real issues, particularly, I suppose, back, when you get back 10 years or so, real issues around data provenance, how it was handled, who did what, and whether we can even trust it. And we just seem to have a pattern here where again and again, we're not finding one little issue with one paper. We're finding many issues in many papers. The sign at the top paper had 2 independent instances of fraud. Across this paper on rituals, we've got a combination of poor research practice, missing data that no one knows about, and possibly data that's made up. We really don't know what's happening, but we can say that we've got a real systematic pattern across this. And it's something that we should be, I think we should see it as a reflection on the field, not just on Gino's work. So that's quite a pretty long story that starts with like a little sign at the top paper, sort of back in 2012, ending all the way in this massive investigation across the literature, exposing such a broad swathe of dodgy research practice. So that's where I'm going to end my little segment on the replication crisis and research practice. I'm going to now transition a little bit into what we do in response. And although I should say this also ends up in a bit of an unhappy ending. So last year, a really interesting paper published in Nature Human Behavior. And actually the co-authors of this paper are some of the major drivers of the open science movement and some of the earlier papers. So Brian Nozick, who probably the main, I guess the spokesperson and real center main guy in the open science collaboration. Also got Leif Nelson, one of the Data Cloud people on this paper. But basically what they did is they wanted to understand how good research practices, the sort of practices we should be using to avoid the train wreck I've just been talking about, how could they improve the rigor of scientific practice? And so what they did is they ran four different labs, ran pilot studies to go, what are some interesting effects that we could examine? And then once they found some effects, each lab ran a high-powered confirmation test to see if there was an effect. So those, and what they did to try and give this robustness, so one, they ran this as a confirmation test, like they'd already done a pilot and then said, let's run this with a large sample size to confirm it. They pre-registered each of those particular tests and were really transparent in the methodology that they provided within those analysis plans. And what they found is when they then handed those confirmatory tests back to another lab to run a replication of those tests, they actually found that 86% of the attempts replicated. And this is more than you would expect given the power of the replications. And the replications also had effect sizes 97% of the original. So in some ways, we have a bit of a victory here. So you recall that the charts I showed you of the Many Labs project where only 36% replicated and the effect size was vastly lower in the replications. Here we've got, under good practice, we've got pretty high replication rate, as high as we could expect given the sample size, and effect sizes almost holding up as high as the original. But now for the twist. This study was pre-registered itself. And the authors wrote, all confirmatory tests, replications, analyses were pre-registered, both in the individual studies and for this meta project. Now, this is where this is the bit where some bit of data sleuthing by a few people gets really interesting. So a few people then went and read these pre-registrations, and in particular, the pre-registration for the meta project. And the story's a bit murky here. There's a little bit of to and fro around what exactly happening. There's a lot of really interesting documents to read about this. But basically, the story seems to be is that the original authors of this paper, they proposed to run an experiment to examine the decline effect. And this is a phenomena where if you repeatedly run an experiment, the effect sizes tend to decline. And so they pre-registered a plan to examine that. However, in this case, the decline wasn't actually observed. The results replicated and the effect sizes were just as large. So what they did is they changed tack. They turned it into a story about replication practices. Except this meant that now their pre-registration didn't match what they actually did. This statement that tests that the tests for the meta project were pre-registered was actually false. And as a result, this paper itself about good research practices has ended up in retraction. So a paper about the benefits of pre-registration fails as it was not pre-registered, or more particularly, as the hypotheses that were actually tested weren't pre-registered. So here we go. We've got this continued irony in results. So we've got honesty papers being discussed, scuttled by dishonesty, and we've got a paper about pre-registration going down because the pre-registration wasn't up to scratch. So what else have we got going on in 2024? So the next bit I want to talk about is actually, again, the story starts a couple of years before. And it moves us a little bit into the applied domain. And I should say, like, this bit of work is somewhere like, I think this bit of work is amazing. And it's kind of like a real hat tip to those who have been a part of it. And this story involves two papers. So the first paper published in Econometrica by Delavegna and Linos. For those who aren't in academic circles, this is Econometrica is one of our top 5 journals. So it's the key to getting tenure at a good school. So they've done pretty well getting that. And in this particular study, what they did is they got hold of a whole bunch of studies from the North American arm of the Behavioural Insights team. And the Behavioural Insights team, this is like all due credit to them for this, but consistently recording their results and then handing it over to the academics for analysis. And in this paper, they looked at 126 randomized controlled trials. And then on top of that, compared that to a series of a sample of nudges from academic journals. And how does it look when you look from the applied trials run from the Behavioural Insights team to the academic world? And here's what I think is the core chart from that paper. So on the left is this sample of academic papers. As you can see, pretty large effects, also pretty big error bars, those lines on either side of the dot, so that sort of indicate sort of, I guess, the precision of the estimates. And that comes from their low sample size. In the nudge units, much lower effect sizes and also much tighter bars given much better samples. So to actually quantify this, the average effect size in the academic journal sample was 8.7 percentage points, and the average effect size for the nudges run out in the wild was 1.4 percentage points. That's an 8% increase relative to whatever the baseline percent was. I should also note, I always find this funny, like Brian Wansink is sort of, I guess, the real outlier pointed out here. Brian, I'm not going to tell the story of Brian Wansink today, but there's another story of an absolute train wreck of research practice. Now, this story, some people see this as a story of, like, in some ways, again, like maybe it's a poor reflection on the academic practice that's out there. I actually think in some ways this is a story of success. Like finding 1.4 percentage point changes for how low cost many of these nudges are, I think is a pretty amazing thing. So this nudge unit work is really great. But this is where we come to 2024 and we get to the bit where we go, oh dear. Because in 2024, so just a few months ago, published in the Journal of Political Economy, another, so Delavegna and Linos involved here, but also bringing in Wijing Kim. And what they did is they went and looked at a subset of those experiments that the Behavioural Insights team had run in North America and said, what happened to them? Were they actually implemented in after the experiments were run? And here's a chart showing sort of, I guess, the experiments that they looked at, the effect sizes, and whether or not they were adopted or not. And what you might note, if you look at sort of some of them, they've got, I guess, these hollow dots. And these hollow dots are ones where it was not adopted. And the ones which are colored in, shaded in green, they're the ones that were adopted. And at least look at it visually and you go, hang on, that's kind of interesting. Some of the effect sizes, some of the trials with the largest effect sizes were not adopted. Some of those with even some of them with negative effect sizes were implemented. And that sort of, I guess, eyeball test also matches what Delavegna, Kim, and Linos found. So they found that we find that the strength of the evidence and the key features do not strongly predict adoption. Instead, the largest predictor is whether the RCT was implemented using pre-existing communication as opposed to new communication. And indeed, stating it more directly, we find surprisingly limited support for the role of evidence in adoption. There's no difference in adoption for results with negative point estimates, 25%, results with positive but not statistically significant, 25%, or estimates that are positive and statistically significant, 30%. So what we've got is we've got this really great process to try and generate evidence, and yet the evidence isn't the major thing that's driving the result. Now, my cynical side says this is because governments love shiny things. Behavioral science is still a shiny thing. Let's run a trial. That's super exciting. The hard work of implementation is what goes on. But I also want to say, like, I don't want this to appear to be just a pure criticism of what's happening here. I think it's really amazing that researchers are getting to ask these questions. So the Behavioural Insights team, I think they've got a good enough reputation that they could be strolling around with slide decks full of pictures of brains and Dan Ariely studies, and they'd still rake in a bucket load of government dollars. But they're actually willing to turn the microscope onto themselves and, in effect, those who they're working with, to try and understand, well, how can they actually make themselves more effective? So I think this is, like, although slightly depressing in some ways and slightly disappointing, the mere fact this work is happening for me is actually a real green shoot and something that should be applauded. So I think it's a fantastic paper and a fantastic bit of work. But it's not quite my favorite paper from this year. I'm going to close with what I think is my favorite paper from this year. It's actually just, I think, this week formally come out in the latest edition of American Economic Review, although it's been available, published for a few months now, and in fact, a preprint since last year. But I'm going to talk a little bit about this, what I think my favorite paper. So it's a paper by Ryan Aprea, and a paper called Decisions Under Risk are Decisions Under Complexity. And what this particular paper concerns is whether the analysis we've been doing of decisions under risk really captures what we think it's capturing. And here, let's have a look at what I mean by that. So go back to Kahneman Tversky's famous paper on prospect theories. That's probably the major theory on decision making under risk in behavioral economics. And you'd be asked questions like this. So would you prefer choice A, 50% chance to win 1,000, 50% chance to win nothing, or choice B, 50% for sure? And quite a lot of people pick B, and that's because they're risk averse. And of course, you'll end up then, if you plot this as a utility function, or in this, I should say, technically a value function, looks a little bit like this. This is straight out of Kahneman Tversky's paper, where people are risk averse when they're in the domain of gains, and they're risk seeking in the domain of losses. What they also did is they combined this with what's called probability weighting. So when we're considering a gamble, we actually also look at the probability, and we don't look at those probabilities linearly. Like, we actually give them slightly different weights, and we tend to overweight small probabilities. So 1% gets more weight than 1% when we're looking at a gamble. You combine those together, and what you end up is what's called this fourfold pattern of risk preferences. So under prospect theory, when people are just a normal to high probability, they're risk averse when it comes to a gain. They're risk seeking when it comes to a loss. So they're willing to take a risk to avoid loss. And when it's a low probability, like a fraction of percent, that should become risk seeking when it's a gain, or risk averse when it's a loss. And just to give you examples of each of these quadrants, the bottom left might be a lottery. It's a gain, so people might normally be risk averse. Because it's low probability and they probably overweight it, they become risk seeking. Similarly for insurance. Insurance is a low probability loss. So in this bottom right quadrant, yes, normally for losses, they might be risk seeking, but again, they might overweight the probability of a fire. And as a result, they're willing to buy insurance. So that's the traditional story behavioral economists have been talking about risk for, well, since 1979 at least. Now, what did Ryan Aprea do? Well, what he did is he gave people a whole bunch of questions that look a lot like this classical sort of decision-making under risk. So each experimental participant, they're offered a choice between set A and set B. And each of those sets is a group of 100 boxes. And those boxes would each contain different dollar amounts. So for example, here, set A, 75% of the boxes contain $20, 25 boxes contain nothing. And so in the decision-making under risk conditions, they'll be told that once they chose set A or set B, one of the boxes in the set would be opened and they'd be paid that amount. And the amounts and probability would be varied over a series of choices, just like your typical prospect theory experiment. So you get to see, how do people respond, whether it's a gain or a loss, when the probabilities are small or large, how do people respond to those? And then to try and understand, well, what's their risk preference? But here's where the innovation comes in here. So instead of saying that once participants would pick a box, they'll be paid the amount in one particular box, so the amount would be drawn out the box. Instead, they were told they'll be paid the average amount of the boxes in that set with certainty. So if you do a bit of math on the ones I've got in front of you, if someone was paid the average amount in set A, they would be paid $15 with certainty. So effectively, they'd have a choice between $15 with certainty and $7 with certainty. Now you think, no brainer, let's pick set A. But a lot of people pick set B. And what Oprah found is if you have this thing where instead of people getting a draw, 1 in 100 draw out of set A with a risky choice, instead it's an average, so it's actually an amount with certainty but still requires some calculation. The pattern of decision making looked a lot like it does under prospect theory. So what does that actually mean? It actually means that perhaps when people are turning down certain gambles or accepting other gambles, they're actually not doing it because of their risk preference. They're doing it just because it's really hard to calculate what amounts are. Because what they do is they're showing the same pattern even when there is no risk. So effectively, a prayer is saying it's complexity driving this result, not risk preference. And I think that's really quite amazing. And this is part of a broader trend in behavioral economics. It's what some people are calling the cognitive turn in behavioral economics, where many of the biases and heuristics we talk about are actually being they're being thought about more now as simplification strategies we use to reduce or manage information processing demands. And when you think to what we've been doing in applied behavioral economics for the last 10, 15 years, it kind of matches. So much we do in applied spaces around simplification. It's around getting attention. It's around trying to make the cognitive effort easy. Like you think about behavioral insights team with E for easy right at the beginning. It's kind of why it's so effective. And so as a result, the applied science is a little bit ahead, at least in terms of where the benefits might be to the academic side. But still, I think this is really amazing work, because what we've got here is we've got a framework from 1979, being challenged in a fairly major way. Major way. And this is sort of, I guess, in some ways, perhaps the paradigm change, where it really starts to change how we think about people making decisions, risky decisions, making gambles, or making choice more generally. Now, as a final comment on this particular experiment and paper, I want to distinguish this from the stories I've told about the replication crisis. So when I've given sort of versions of these stories in talks before, people often say, isn't this just science? Like someone proposes something and other people tear it down. And I think that's right. That is science. But people proposing crap and people having to clean up that crap, I don't think that's great science. Whereas here you've got a really robust body of experimental evidence around prospect theory, and now a new way of looking at it. And that to me feels much more scientific. It's not just people, chasing, so I suppose, publications and clicks. It's something much more robust than that. So I like to see this in a much more positive light than I do. One other way of thinking about it is, for the replication crisis, if we just erase that work, no one would care. Those decades of research into prospect theory, even if the paradigm is eventually overturned, all that evidence is still going to be super valuable in thinking about what comes next. And that, I've gone even longer, much longer than I planned to, but that's what happens when you get warmed up. And that is all I have and where I wind up for today.
Awesome, amazing work, mate. Generated quite a few comments and questions in the chat. Now, Michael, I know it's late for you, but if you do want to come off mute and video and ask your question and any of your comments, do call out. Otherwise, I will read through.
Go on then. All right. Hi.
Yeah.
It's Kim in New York. Hi, Jason. Thanks for the talk. I thought I'd join because it's a topic that obviously interests me. Nice to see the work with Elizabeth Linos and Stefana Del Vigna mentioned. Yeah, I just put some things in the chat about how to interpret those papers. One question I wanted to ask you in general was, in your view, it seems like quite a lot of the questionable maybe p-hack studies are ones where often there isn't a very clear practical implication. And that's partly because they are measuring things that are constructs in the laboratory rather than in the real world. The Ariely stuff is definitely a different case. But if you take like sort of a lot of Gino's work, and you mentioned this, the idea that if these things weren't true and they hadn't happened, would it be so problematic? I think quite a lot of the stuff like didn't have any particular real world implications. So on that side of it, in terms of how you're spending like public money, it not replicating has had a limited impact. I wonder if you kind of agree with that generalization, or if there's anything in that.
Yeah, no, I think there definitely is, and I suppose the final story that I sort of told around moving how behavioral economics, in fact, is moving a little bit more towards this world of the cognitive turn in behavioral economics, thinking much more around complexity. Like I actually think that there's actually gonna be a real drive there to actually bring it be a little bit more applied, because as soon as you start thinking about complexity, you start having to think a lot about what is actually the type of environment that people will be making real decisions. You have to start to bring that in, because every time you abstract away all the interesting things to run a nice lab experiment, suddenly you have nothing left that sort of that you have in the real world, and you start to go, is there any benefit in this? But I think when you say, like, when you go back to those business studies, I'm not like, on one half on one part of me goes, yeah, I think that's true, like that's my own view. But of course, a lot of those people, when they're pitching them, like you read the final discussion part of those papers, and they actually see them having really big real world impacts, and I think they're wrong. But part of the thing which I guess makes me particularly I guess animated about this is that they actually get quite a lot of bandwidth in people's minds. They get brought up a lot in even training for behavioral economists. Like you see them shown a lot, and so they're still taking up a lot of space. But yeah, when it comes down to it, hits the road, and you go, what am I going to do? Like, I've got a real problem. I've got real people. I've got real citizens making decisions. I want to help them. Yeah, you're almost never turning to those. In fact, as I say, you're turning to easy. Like that's those sort of areas where you really happen to find the real benefits.
Awesome. All good, Michael? Thank you. And thank you for dialing in from New York. Jason, we've got a question from Claire. Claire says, I know I'm muddying the waters here by bringing in a constructivist lens to a more positive space, but I wonder how much the aspects of reflexivity are being brought into behavioral science. Not in the case of fraud, just general reproducibility.
Sorry, what do you mean by reflexivity?
Claire, are you also on? Do you want to come off mute?
Hi, hello. Thanks very much, Jason. Really interesting talk. I'm from a little bit more of a qualitative background, and in terms of reflexivity, it's like acknowledging the role of power and positionality. And I know there are like adjacent concepts that can't be lifted into behavioral economics necessarily, but is there any thought within the discipline that we're using potentially this abstraction to the point that we're not looking at the people who are running the numbers as part of their methodology?
Yeah, I'm not sure I've got a smart answer to that. But I think it is interesting. It's possibly maybe why I find that behavioral, well, the Delavina and Linos work particularly interesting, because it's like you start to dig into it and think about it a lot, and like, it's really hard to just abstract an experimental result away and say I've got a win here. You're actually implementing these in a complex system, and I recently wrote about the paper in a slightly different context around thinking about policy making and the like as a complex system where you've got a lot of different players, a lot of different interests, a lot of different incentives, power structures and the like. And it's only and you go and run a nice little experiment, you think I've won, but no, actually, in fact, in the more complex system that you've got with again the various interests of the players, it's actually much more difficult. So from an applied behavioral science perspective, like I know it becomes, I don't know if the word's confusing. But you start just going, holy moly, like the simple idea of running an RCT and going, yeah, I've done it is really difficult. Like, and then take a step back and go, I'm running a very abstracted lab experiment, and then trying to put it into the real world. Like, have I stripped out everything that's actually, not just like, have I stripped out everything that's not just necessarily going to interfere with my effect, but everything that's going to basically, that I need to think about if I'm ever going to try and translate that from a lab into an outside context.
Yeah, it's a fascinating discussion, especially as you move into that wicked problem space. So like, what node in the system is going to be the one that we should zoom in on, and who benefits from that intervention? So I guess like that role of reflexivity and sort of being like, well, we're designing this behavioral intervention so we can dial up this behavior because we're coming from this perspective of it. But yeah, anyway, thanks for the presentation. Really interesting.
Yes.
Edmund, do you want to come off mute too?
Yeah, sure. Hi there, Jason.
Hi.
Thanks for a very interesting presentation. I'm from a technology perspective, so very naive views of the whole psychology space and behavioral economics. So one of the things that strikes me when I look at these reports and presentations and such like is that the starting point seems to be not particularly robust. So the hypothesis that of an experiment, you just think, are you jumping to conclusions here? Like the marshmallow test is I think a really good example. Makes for a lovely TED talk, but it turns out that the conclusion was not what they believed it was. So I guess my question is really around the starting point. How do you identify a meaningful hypothesis? How do you construct it and define it in this very sort of squidgy space? And
yes,
like Claire mentioned, wicked problems as well. It's you're not trying to figure out what the acceleration of gravity is by dropping a ball off a tower, sort of thing.
Yeah. Funny enough, like one of these days, like I keep meaning to write a defense of the marshmallow test, but anyway. But what you're hitting on there is actually one of my really big bugbears, which I actually started writing about this for this presentation, then realized it was just like I was already getting way too big. But is around like the role of theory in behavioral economics, behavioral science, and so much of what is proposed, what is tested, is just very weak on theory. It's kind of like just just a random idea. So an example of God, thinking about God making us more likely to accept AI. It's just like, oh yeah, that sounds a cool idea. I'm just like, signing at the top, oh yeah. And then people will try and bolt on a bit of theory after the fact, but there's no sort of central construct of going, actually, here's how people sort of tend to make decisions. Here's a set of, probably not one model. Here's a series of models. Within this particular model, here's what I might expect. Here's a hypothesis. Now I'm going to test that hypothesis. Instead, it's like, here's a funky idea that might get published in a journal. And that leads, like, it means that a lot of time the sort of things you're testing, a lot of time that there's no good reason for expecting to find something. And even where you do, you're probably not finding it for the reason that you really are. So again, that's another reason why I really like that work by Ryan O'Praya I showed at the end, is like a lot underneath it, there's a real body of thinking around going, like, what is actually the cognitive processing mechanisms people are using to try and make decisions, and given that, what might we see experimentally, and they're actually sort of hypotheses that are coming from somewhere, as opposed to that'd be cool and doing it. Although I should also say, like, you take a step back, and Kahneman and Tversky, like many of their most famous experiments way back that they first published, were thought experiments. They'd wander around, have coffee, and go, oh, that'd be interesting to test. But in the end, though, like they put some effort in to try and tie it together, and so it's a slightly different order of things. And maybe it kind of worked. Maybe they're just lucky what they hit upon, that it had so much of it, they were able to tie it together usefully. But now what you set up is here, you have so much here is proliferation of biases. So when someone does find something, it just gets left out there. It's just hanging there. It's sitting there. You go, how do I bring this in? I've got this idea. Like, does this help my view of the world? And so often it's kind of like, well, actually, I don't know. I don't know how to bring it in. It's just hanging there.
But thank you. Yeah, that's really interesting to hear you talk about that and figuring out the theory and where the hell you start from. I wonder if some of this is sort of, you know, you touched on like getting paper published and so on. I think they're kind of working backwards from, you know, how do I how do I come up with a really good finding that I can give a TED talk for, or get a paper published in Nature or something. So I wonder what maybe behind all of this is the incentive structure.
Oh, absolutely. Like, so the incentive structure is very clear still. It's like, you know, all the incentives to me as an academic are to get papers. You know, there's no incentive for me to, you know, talk today. There's no, there's no incentive for me to, you know, just go, I'm just going to really work things out for 3 years and then come and pop my head back up again. Because I'll pop my head back up and I'll be fired. So it's the sort of thing where yeah, very clear. Yeah. There's not a great structure for us to be doing the sort of work that we should be doing, and yeah, so that's the next level down. Just kind of hope though, like underneath it all, you can't. A lot of academics, you know, we have tenure or fairly solid employment, and just the willingness to take the occasional bullet to go, okay, I've really got to do this properly.
Thanks very much. Cheers.
We have time for one last question from one of our good friends over in New Zealand. Vishal, do you want to come up from mute, mate?
Kia ora. Hi, Jason. Hi, team. Thanks for being the skeptic of behavioral science and sharing your wisdom with us. The question I had was a little bit of a reflection, but also keen to hear if you have any thoughts on how you would approach this. One of the challenges I face is maybe while thinking about behavioral science, we quite often prioritize scientific methodologies. So we think about, let's say if we have a problem like organ donation, let's look at what scientific what does a academic research say about it. So we do a literature review, we find out that a default option works really well. Yeah. But we lack a common sense approach. So that study doesn't work very well because people aren't willing to have a conversation about donating their to a loved one when they've just lost a family member. So we somehow have lost common sense or practicality while thinking about scaling interventions with maybe an over-reliance on literature and scientific methodologies. I wonder how you think about scaling interventions and if you have any thoughts or reflections on the same.
Sure. So yeah, think about common sense. I find it quite interesting because you talk about most other fields. Like, so if I was going to try and, you know, rely on common sense for medicine, like I'd be terrified. But when you look in some of the recent papers comparing expert predictions, so behavioural practitioner predictions to lay people predictions of what will work, say messaging vaccinations, that kind of thing. And basically the general story is most of it is that no one has any idea, or occasionally common sense outperforms the expert. And so to me, it's really depressing that we don't have a strong enough body of theory, of a good enough structure to our ideas that we can actually look at a set of hypotheses and say, I actually think it's more likely this one's going to be true than that one. This is going to work. And so recently, I've actually been, you know, calling for this a bit more of like just having a few more, you know, for want of a better word, weirdos. Just like, you know, so it could be marketers, it could be just randoms contributing ideas to like what could actually be changing behavior and throwing those into our experiments to test into our applied work to try and, you know, try to understand two things. Like, one, to understand, like, does all this science we supposedly do before the applied work actually mean anything? And then secondly, just to go, well, maybe we can get some better ideas. Maybe they have skills we don't have. Like, you know, for a start, you look at our copywriting as behavioral scientists, we're hopeless. We're not copywriters. Yet we keep copywriting messages. So maybe we could find others who could help us out a bit there. Yeah, but then the next part, which I think about the scientific method, is, I'm skirting around your question in some ways here, but is like the randomized controlled trial is a real centerpiece of what we do, probably for good reason. But at the same time, it's a real constraint because of course we're always looking under the street light for our keys. We trial things where we can run a trial. Not everything can run a clean trial. Sometimes you do things that are dirty, messy, bigger. And yeah, sometimes. So I feel sometimes we put the brakes on what we should be doing because of that, and for good reasons or otherwise. And yes, so similarly there, like I'm not sure if it's common sense saves us, but again, there's the constraint of like this. We sometimes, I think, we play in smaller playgrounds than we should because we're always trying to look for a randomized control trial.
Kia ora, thank you.
Awesome. So thank you, Jason. Thanks everyone for staying with us. We have gone over, but a hell of a good conversation at the end there. So that, as I said, this is the last one for next year. For this year, we'll be back again next year, probably Feb. So look out for us in the usual channels, and we'll be telling you who the speaker is. But thank you, Jason, for such a great talk.
That's going on.